So since I'm just starting out on this channel, I've given a lot of thought to what my first video or videos should be, and I thought we should take it nice and slow and start off with something easy like a 6-part series on world building. I'm not joking, this is a 6-part series on world building. I'm going to start off with physical world building, 3 videos on the actual physical world that you're going to be building on, and then after that I'm going to do 3 videos on building a culture and what cultural world building looks like. Okay, so since this is week 1, we're going to start off with water sources and land formations. This is like the barest bones of your world. This is just the bedrock foundations of your world. Okay? So the very first thing that is the number one most important thing in your world at all for any sort of carbon-based landform to exist is water. Now, if you're not going to be writing with carbon-based landforms, you're way out in the in the avant-garde there, and I can't help you with that. My style is a little more grounded, as it were. But for those land and water animals that we recognize that are Earth-like, you need water, and you need a lot of it. And ideally, you need fresh water, but there are, of course, creatures that exist quite comfortably in salt water. I'm gonna proceed from the perspective of humans, just because I know the most about humans, but a lot of these things apply to if your story is, it revolves around non-human creatures, or even like animal characters, a lot of these things will still apply. Probably more the physical world building than the cultural, but that's a debate we'll get into at a different time. Alright, so number one thing is water. You need a water source, and a large water source. The most obvious large water source is the ocean, or seas, or, whatever other large saltwater bodies of water. And the reason why you need so much water is because it's not just used for drinking, which we do need water to survive. You can live for I think 7 days without food, but water, you really need it for, I think, 3 days is as long as you can go without water. But it's not just for drinking, it's also for travel. It is a source of food in terms of waterfowl or fish and other water mammals, or even sea vegetables like seaweeds that are edible. Also, there are vitamins and minerals that are found more readily in the ocean, among them being salt. But also things like, I think iodine is found in seaweed. I think there are a lot of minerals that are found in the ocean that are not as easily found on land. It's good for trade. It's good for, obviously, recreation. People hang out at beaches. People like to go sailing, etc. There are a lot of things that the ocean, and actually most waterways, provide besides just drinking. It's also good for agriculture and the watering of livestock. You use it in production, like you use water wheels to grind grains. Also, we use it in pretty much every aspect of our lives. There's very little industry that doesn't have water. Like in ceramics, you use water to wet the clay. In blacksmithy, you use water to cool the metal sometimes. I know oil is preferred, but water is used sometimes. So water is life. It's non-negotiable. You gotta have water. Fresh water is different than salt water. Obviously, it has a different effect on the body. It has a different effect on the surrounding land. Obviously, ocean water is not good for irrigating crops. Fresh water is much better for that. Your people might even have deep reservoir. Oh, one thing to note about saltwater, if they live on the ocean or on the coast, they need to also have a source of fresh water, or they need to have some sort of like desalinization method or something. You need to have that fresh water in order for it to have that realistic feel to your world. Deep reservoirs are also an option. There are some areas, like a lot of desert communities, that appear to not have any water, but they do actually have deep reservoirs, and so wells will be very important features in those communities. Rainfall sometimes is a deciding factor. It could be that you have an arid region, but a couple of times a year there is enormous rainfall, and they collect that. There are some deserts in the world where there are plants and animals who survive there. And the plants survive by absorbing that water, and the animals survive by eating those plants. And that's how extremely arid areas can still support life. Artificial water. What I mean by artificial water is places that get water that don't have a reliable source of water already. Like, one example would be some desert communities that might trade for water. Or there's the island of Santorini, for example, is extremely arid. They actually import water they actually have a huge financial crisis because all of the drinkable and usable water they have is shipped in from mainland Greece. So all their drinking water comes in bottles. All of the water that's used in restaurants and in homes is shipped in because it's a very, very dry island. Despite being surrounded by water, the island itself is dry of fresh water. In fact, they have a very unique way of growing grapes because they have a wine industry. But the way they grow their grapes is that the grapes don't kind of like sprawl along sort of fences like they do in areas with higher rainfall, like California, like France, wherever. What they do is they actually dig these little holes, these little shallow holes, and they kind of like, their grapevines look like nests. And what that does is they just kind of like huddle in there to conserve the water they already have, and to conserve whatever groundwater is left after watering. So they don't just hang out and just grab the rain, because there is no rain. So they have to keep it together. So that's something to consider when you're considering how much water your community has access to. The other thing in this section is the actual land. This is the mountains and valleys, right? So this is, if you're looking at a topographical map of your area, this is what all those circles and circles are that represent altitude. So mountains and valleys are what give your land texture. So, but they're also important to consider because they actually do have an effect on the land. So mountains will have high altitude, which might make it difficult for people to breathe or people to live, but also there are studies that say people who live in high altitude regions live longer. So that's cool. People in valleys, like for instance, I live in a valley, and we have a ton of air quality issues because we're surrounded by 3 large cities, and all of their smog just kind of sits in my valley. So that's just an example, but there are other things. Also, valleys tend to be very fertile. This valley is very fertile. The Central Valley of California produces 75% of the agriculture that's eaten by the whole country. The people, not the cattle. That's mostly the Midwest does the cattle. Does food for the cattle. Valleys tend to be like bowls where they hold, when it rains in the mountains, all that water runs off into the valleys, and the valleys hold it, and that's why they are so fertile. Plains and grasslands are sort of a flat expanse of land. They can also sometimes be very fertile. That's where you're going to have a lot of arable farmland and a lot of pasture land and a lot of pack animals, a lot of herd animals, because there's a lot of wide open spaces where large groups of animals can just kind of congregate and move around and find better grass. So these areas tend to have rural farming communities because there is a lot of usable land. Deserts and tundra. Deserts and tundra are very similar. They're very arid. Tundra is a cold desert, essentially. Even though there is snow, it's permafrost. It's not water that goes into the ground. It's water that just sits on top of the ground. Deserts do still have life, like I was saying earlier about the plants that absorb the rare rains and the animals that eat the plants. You have very heat and dryness adapted animals, a lot of lizards, obviously things like cactuses or cacti. These are also things to consider when you're fleshing out your world. And then the opposite, wetlands. So these are marshes and swamps and bayous and that sort of thing, where you have a lot of standing, usually freshwater, sometimes it's brackish saltwater. You have a lot of amphibious creatures, a lot of animals that feed on amphibious creatures, a lot of insects. These are areas that obviously are very high moisture areas, so they will have their own set of problems associated with, standing water. Last thing I want to talk about is air. Now this is a little bit more out there, possibly. You don't get a lot of things that just live in the air, but a lot of sci-fi and a lot of fantasy does like to explore that option of things like floating cities or vehicles that are large enough and stable enough for people to live on, just communities of people or animals or floating islands or whatever, things that are up in the air for extended periods of time. Obviously, you'll have to have excuses for why they're up there, and you'll have to have reasons, or you have to have methods for how they get resources that are otherwise only available on land. Do they grow their own food? Do they have their own water and mountains and valleys? Or are they like a spaceship, or I guess a ship, not a spaceship, but they have to dock every so often to pick up supplies? That's something to consider. Also, air quality is something to consider. Things like altitude affect how much of any particular gas is in the air, and therefore what kinds of creatures and plants can live at that altitude. Also, things like going back to air quality, like I said, the air quality in my town, for instance, is very bad. So the way we live around it is we either have like a HEPA filter going all the time, or we just keep our windows closed, because a lot of us have lung diseases related to poor air quality. So that's something to consider also, especially if you're writing in like a dystopia where there are a lot of or even historical fiction, if you're talking about big cities during the Industrial Revolution, when you have all those big factories that are just pumping out, all the black smoke, and how it affected people's lungs. So these are things to consider about the actual physicality of your world. So I'm going to stop it there because this video is getting kind of long and I don't want it to be super duper long. So come back next week and I will move on to the next bit, which is flora and fauna. We're going to be talking about the actual inhabitants of the world that you're creating. Okay? Be sure to like and subscribe and come back next week.